I'm fluent in 10 languages, the young woman stated firmly. Judge Morrison's laughter filled the courtroom like rolling thunder, his amusement uncontrolled as he gazed at the 25-year-old defendant standing with bound wrists before his bench. 10 languages, he repeated, still chuckling. Miss Carter, this is a legal proceeding, not an audition for a reality show. Maya Carter remained perfectly still, her dark eyes locked on the magistrate who held her future in his hands. She'd been arrested 4 days ago at her modest apartment in the outskirts of Chicago, charged with fabricating educational credentials to secure employment as a professional interpreter at international corporations. The arrest had been public, televised, turning her struggle into a nationwide spectacle. District Attorney Richard Stevens, impeccably dressed with a condescending expression, theatrically shuffled his documents. Your Honor, the accused claims fluency in English, Spanish, French, Mandarin Chinese, Arabic, German, Russian, Japanese, Portuguese, and Italian. Her educational background? A high school diploma from an inner-city school. The deception is transparent. I never claimed false degrees, Maya responded calmly, surprising the courtroom observers. Most defendants stayed silent during preliminary proceedings. But my lack of university credentials doesn't make my abilities fraudulent. Judge Morrison's eyebrow arched, his entertainment shifting toward irritation. Ms. Carter, I recommend you cease this embarrassing display. Evidence suggests you collected substantial fees for services you couldn't possibly deliver. Respectfully, Your Honor, Maya replied, maintaining perfect posture despite her restraints. You're reaching conclusions without hearing my defense. If permitted, I can demonstrate. Demonstrate? Morrison interrupted, laughing again. What will you do? Recite some phrases from a translation app? In the front row, attorney Sarah Chen, who'd volunteered to represent Maya after seeing news coverage, watched with mounting frustration. She'd advised against this confrontational approach, but Maya had been adamant about proving herself in court. Your Honor, Dr. Chen rose, my client deserves a proper defense. If she claims these capabilities, why not allow verification? Morrison adjusted his spectacles, clearly annoyed. Because it's absurd, Dr. Chen. Consider her background. A young black woman, no higher education, raised in subsidized housing. How would she possibly master 10 languages? The silence that followed was crushing. Reporters exchanged shocked glances. Jury members shifted uncomfortably. The prejudice statement had been spoken aloud, recorded, broadcast to thousands. But Maya showed no surprise. Her eyes narrowed slightly, revealing not anger, but steely resolve. The expression of someone who'd faced identical doubt countless times and developed endless patience for proving ignorance wrong. What Maya knew, and what would soon shock everyone in that courtroom, was that the judge's bias had just sealed his own fate, because sometimes the most powerful weapon against prejudice is simply the undeniable truth. But could she prove it before they destroyed her completely? Your Honor, Maya said with unnerving calmness, you've just demonstrated precisely why I'm standing here today. Not because I fabricated my abilities, but because society refuses to accept that people like me can possess exceptional talents. Morrison frowned, sensing he'd adventured onto dangerous ground. But the cameras had captured everything, and something in Maya's voice suggested she wasn't merely another desperate defendant. She seemed to be guarding knowledge too powerful to reveal prematurely, patiently waiting for the system to expose its own prejudices. District Attorney Richard Stevens seized the moment to intensify his attack. Your Honor, we're representing 4 multinational corporations that hired the defendant's services. Tech Global International lost a $3 million contract due to severely flawed translations from English to Mandarin. Embassy services had legal documents rejected by foreign consulates because of egregious errors in French and Arabic. He waved documentation dramatically. Most concerning, World Aid Humanitarian Foundation have their relief proposal rejected by the United Nations because the Russian translations were so incompetent they appeared intentionally sabotaged. Each accusation landed like a public blow. Maya could feel judgmental stares from observers, the weight of disbelief, the automatic assumption of guilt that perpetually followed people of her background. Yet her reaction was peculiar. She didn't appear surprised, just profoundly sad, as though she knew exactly where these allegations originated. "Miss Carter," Morrison leaned forward, adopting a falsely compassionate tone, "you have an opportunity here to acknowledge your mistakes, accept a plea arrangement, and potentially receive reduced sentencing. Abandon this charade and speak honestly." Maya opened her eyes and did something that stunned everyone present. She smiled, not bitterly or in defeat, but with knowing confidence. The kind of smile worn by someone holding information others lack. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "may I pose questions regarding these accusing companies?" Stevens frowned. "What kind of questions?" "I'd like to know when precisely Tech Global International determined my translation was incorrect. Was it before or after they discovered I lacked university credentials?" Uncomfortable silence descended. Stevens hastily rifled through his papers. That's irrelevant to—" "And embassy services," Maya continued, her voice strengthening. "Did they reject my work before or after learning I grew up in Riverside projects?" Riverside was Chicago's most notorious public housing development, nationally known for poverty and violence. Mentioning it made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. Dr. Chen recognized her client's strategy and stood. "Objection, Your Honor. My client raises legitimate concerns about potential discrimination." "Overruled." Morrison struck his gavel. "The defendant's background doesn't justify fraudulent behavior." But Maya wasn't finished, and in the gallery, an elderly Korean woman with silver hair quietly rose, her eyes fixed on Maya with growing recognition. The woman whispered to her neighbor, "I know that young woman." What she knew was about to change everything, because Maya Carter wasn't just fighting for her innocence, she was about to expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond this courtroom. "Your Honor," Maya continued, with hypnotic precision, "you've just demonstrated precisely why I'm standing here today. Not because I fabricated my abilities, but because society refuses to accept that people like me can possess exceptional talents." Morrison frowned, sensing he'd adventured onto dangerous ground. But the cameras had captured everything, and something in Maya's voice suggested she wasn't merely another desperate defendant. She seemed to be guarding knowledge too powerful to reveal prematurely, patiently waiting for the system to expose its own prejudices. District Attorney Richard Stevens seized the moment to intensify his attack. "Your Honor, we're representing 4 multinational corporations that hired the defendant's services. Tech Global International lost a $3 million contract due to severely flawed translations from English to Mandarin. Embassy services had legal documents rejected by foreign consulates because of egregious errors in French and Arabic." He waved documentation dramatically. "Most concerning, World Aid Humanitarian Foundation have their relief proposal rejected by the United Nations because the Russian translations were so incompetent they appeared intentionally sabotaged." Each accusation landed like a public blow. Maya could feel judgmental stares from observers, the weight of disbelief, the automatic assumption of guilt that perpetually followed people of her background. Yet her reaction was peculiar. She didn't appear surprised, just profoundly sad, as though she knew exactly where these allegations originated. "Miss Carter," Morrison leaned forward, adopting a falsely compassionate tone, "you have an opportunity here to acknowledge your mistakes, accept a plea arrangement, and potentially receive reduced sentencing. Abandon this charade and speak honestly." Maya opened her eyes and did something that stunned everyone present. She smiled, not bitterly or in defeat, but with knowing confidence. The kind of smile worn by someone holding information others lack. "Your Honor," Maya said evenly, "may I pose questions regarding these accusing companies?" Stevens frowned. "What kind of questions?" "I'd like to know when precisely Tech Global International determined my translation was incorrect. Was it before or after they discovered I lacked university credentials?" Uncomfortable silence descended. Stevens hastily rifled through his papers. That's irrelevant to—" "And embassy services," Maya continued, her voice strengthening. Did they reject my work before or after learning I grew up in Riverside projects? Riverside was Chicago's most notorious public housing development, nationally known for poverty and violence. My client raises legitimate concerns about potential discrimination. Overruled. Morrison struck his gavel. The defendant's background doesn't justify fraudulent behavior. But Maya wasn't finished. And in the gallery, an elderly Korean woman with silver hair quietly rose, her eyes fixed on Maya with growing recognition. The woman whispered to her neighbor, "I know that young woman." What she knew was about to change everything. Because Maya Carter wasn't just fighting for her innocence, she was about to expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond this courtroom. Your Honor, Maya continued, her voice carrying hypnotic precision. You mentioned it's statistically improbable for someone of my background to speak 10 languages. May I ask how many people from my background you actually know? Morrison's face flushed crimson. Ms. Carter, you're testing my patience dangerously. I'm not testing anything. I'm simply trying to understand whether this court evaluates competence or appearance. At that moment, something extraordinary occurred. The elderly Korean woman in the gallery, Mrs. Kim, stood quietly. She was a retired linguistics professor who'd been following the case through news coverage. Her eyes remained fixed on Maya with intensifying recognition. The courtroom debate continued, but Mrs. Kim whispered urgently to her neighbor, "I taught that young woman." Maya, as if sensing the attention, briefly turned toward the gallery. When her eyes met Kim's, something passed between them, a connection, a shared memory, a secret about to reshape everything. Mrs. Kim retrieved her phone and began typing an urgent message. Meanwhile, Stevens resumed his assault. Your Honor, regardless of the defendant's interesting sociological observations, we possess concrete evidence of incompetence. She caused genuine harm to legitimate businesses. And how, Maya interrupted softly, do you know my translations were incorrect? Do you personally speak Mandarin, Arabic, or Russian? Stevens hesitated. We've consulted experts who verified. Experts, Maya repeated, and that mysterious smile returned. Fascinating, because I'd be intrigued to meet these experts, especially whoever examined my work on Beijing regional dialect versus Shanghai vernacular, or Moroccan Arabic versus Egyptian versus Gulf Arabic, or academic Russian versus conversational versus business formal. The specificity made several linguistics in the gallery lean forward attentively. This wasn't the language of someone faking knowledge. These were distinctions only genuine polyglots would recognize. Mrs. Kim had completed typing and sent a message reading, "Found Maya Carter. It's definitely her. Mobilize everything immediately." Morrison, realizing he was losing control, decided to end the proceedings. Enough. This ridiculous performance ends now. I'll schedule the trial for— One moment, Your Honor. A new voice sliced through the tension. Everyone turned as a distinguished middle-aged man entered the courtroom. His tailored suit commanded respect, and he carried a leather briefcase suggesting important contents. Ambassador Thomas Patterson, retired United Nations diplomat, he introduced himself, walking to the front. I apologize for the interruption, but I possess information critically relevant to this case. Morrison frowned. Ambassador Patterson, this is an active court session. You cannot simply— Your Honor, Patterson interrupted politely but firmly. I've worked with translators and interpreters for 30 decades on diplomatic assignments worldwide. I can testify on oath that I am personally familiar with Maya Carter's work. The silence that followed was absolute. Maya looked at Patterson with an expression mixing surprise and what might have been relief, as if a crucial puzzle piece had just clicked into place. Stevens jumped from his seat, objecting frantically, but Patterson had already extracted documents from his briefcase. I have here official papers from the United Nations, authenticated and notarized, proving that Miss Carter has worked as a contract interpreter for 5 international humanitarian operations over the past 3 years. Her services weren't merely satisfactory, they were exceptional. Morrison appeared to have lost his voice. Stevens frantically searched through his papers, seeking some method to disqualify evidence he'd clearly not anticipated. And Maya, she simply closed her eyes again, accessing some internal reservoir of strength she'd preserved for precisely this moment. When she opened them, a determination burned there that made even Morrison recoil slightly. "Your Honor," Maya said with newfound authority, "I accept your offer of a demonstration, but not here. Not like this, not as entertainment for your amusement." She paused, her gaze scanning every face in the room. The arrogant judge, the desperate prosecutor, her hopeful attorney, and finally the gallery filled with people who'd come to expect her humiliation. "If this court genuinely seeks justice, then allow me to prove not only that I speak 10 languages, but why 4 powerful corporations would willingly lie to destroy a young black woman from disadvantaged circumstances who dares compete in their exclusive world." What nobody in that room knew was that during her 4 days in detention, Maya hadn't simply mourned her unjust situation. She had made calls, activated contacts, and set in motion a plan developed over years, a plan that would transform her apparent destruction into the most devastating exposure of institutional bias the American legal system had ever witnessed. The session was suspended for 3 hours so Patterson could formally present his evidence. During the recess, Maya was escorted to a private conference room where she found not only her attorney, but 4 people she hadn't expected to see. Mrs. Kim, the retired linguistics professor from the gallery, sat beside a young Korean man in his 30s typing intensely on a laptop. Across the table, an elegant black woman in her 50s organized documents with military precision. And standing by the window was a tall Indian man in business attire, reviewing papers intently. "Maya!" Mrs. Kim stood, her eyes shining with tears of pride. "You've accomplished so much. Do you still remember the Mandarin classes at the community center?" The memory struck Maya powerfully. At 15, she discovered Mrs. Kim offering free language instruction to neighborhood children every Saturday. For 4 years, she attended religiously, absorbing not only Mandarin, but also French and German, with a hunger for knowledge that impressed even veteran educators. "Professor Kim," Maya whispered, her composure finally cracking, "I thought you'd return to Seoul." "I did, for 6 years. I worked as an educational consultant for international programs." Mrs. Kim smiled. "And do you know whom I recommended as a freelance interpreter to several global organizations when they needed someone with multilingual capabilities?" The young man at the laptop looked up. "I'm James Park, cybersecurity analyst. Professor Kim hired me to investigate the companies accusing you. What we discovered will demolish this case and expose something far more sinister." James rotated the laptop screen, displaying a complex spreadsheet. "Tech Global International, the first company accusing you. They have a documented pattern of rejecting work from Black and Latino freelancers, regardless of quality. I found internal emails where executives explicitly discuss avoiding non-traditional candidates, their exact phrasing." The elegant black woman introduced herself as Victoria Marshall, corporate litigation attorney. "Maya, Embassy Services is even worse. They maintain 2 separate contractor lists, a premium tier, exclusively for graduates from elite universities, and an experimental tier for diversity, where they place people like you, then discard the work, claiming inadequacy." Maya felt validation and rage rising simultaneously in her chest. "What about World Aid Humanitarian Foundation?" Mrs. Kim sighed deeply. "That discovery was most painful. They rejected your Russian translation because you rendered certain idiomatic expressions literally that an academic translator would have culturally adapted. But your translation was technically flawless. It preserved the authentic meaning that the Russian refugees genuinely wanted to communicate." James continued. "The problem? They preferred the academically polished version from a Yale translator who charged 4 times more, and who transformed a desperate refugee plea into bureaucratic language. Result? The UN rejected the proposal for sounding artificial and disconnected from human urgency." Dr. Chen, who'd remained silent, finally spoke. "Maya, they didn't merely misrepresent your work quality. They created impossible standards where your cultural accuracy was reframed as incompetence." The tall Indian man introduced himself as Dr. Raj Patel, linguistic anthropologist. "I've studied language acquisition in non-traditional learners for 20 years. What you've accomplished is rare but not impossible, yet it threatens an entire industry built on credential gatekeeping. Over the next hour, the team revealed the full scope of their investigation. James had legally accessed, through public records requests and whistleblower leaks, emails showing coordination between the four companies to neutralize the threat of non-credentialed translators offering superior services at competitive rates. Mrs. Kim had contacted international organizations where Maya had worked anonymously, collecting recommendation letters and performance evaluations that completely contradicted the accusations. Victoria had identified a pattern. The four companies belonged to an informal consortium controlling government translation contracts. Maya had begun winning clients who traditionally used only their services, and they'd responded with coordinated sabotage. But most importantly, Mrs. Kim said, handing Maya a thick envelope, "You're not alone. We've identified 17 other freelance translators, Black, Latino, Asian, Indigenous, who've suffered identical sabotage over the past 7 years." Maya opened the envelope to find handwritten testimonials, each telling a familiar story: exceptional talent dismissed, quality work questioned without foundation, contracts canceled after discovery of non-elite educational backgrounds. "You accomplished all this in 4 days?" Maya asked incredulously. "No," James smiled. "Professor Kim has been investigating this for 3 years, ever since she learned that one of her former students was blacklisted by a translation consortium. Your case was simply the catalyst to finally take action," Dr. Patel added. "We've also prepared something else, something that will prove your abilities beyond any doubt, and simultaneously expose exactly how these companies fabricated their accusations." When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had fundamentally transformed. Because what was about to happen wouldn't just prove Maya's innocence, it would trigger a civil rights investigation that would shake the entire professional translation industry to its core. When court reconvened, the gallery was packed beyond capacity. Civil rights journalists, international organization representatives, and numerous faces Maya recognized as freelance translators from immigrant communities filled every available space. Judge Morrison resumed with visible irritation. He'd clearly spent the break researching Ambassador Patterson and discovering he was an internationally respected figure who couldn't be easily dismissed. "Ambassador Patterson," Morrison said with forced respect, "I understand you have evidence regarding the defendant's competence. However, that doesn't necessarily invalidate the specific allegations made by the injured parties." Patterson rose calmly. "Your Honor, with respect, the evidence I'll present not only invalidates those specific allegations, but reveals a pattern of systematic discrimination that transforms this from an individual fraud case into a civil rights matter." Stevens jumped up. "Objection! That's completely outside the scope of—" "Overruled," Morrison interrupted, clearly curious despite himself. "Ambassador Patterson, proceed." Patterson activated a projector. The first image appeared on the courtroom wall, a comprehensive spreadsheet showing translation work rejection rates by demographic categories. "Your Honor, during my diplomatic career, I've worked with hundreds of translators. Our research shows that translators without formal university credentials, specifically those from minority communities, face rejection rates 380% higher than colleagues with degrees, even when work quality is objectively superior." The second image displayed internal emails from Tech Global International. These communications, obtained legally through whistleblowers, show explicit discussions about filtering out problematic profiles from their freelance translator pool. Stevens was visibly pale, desperately searching his documents for non-existent escape routes. The third image was devastating, an audio recording transcript from an embassy services meeting. In this recording, executives discuss using subjective quality standards to reject work from translators who don't match the company's preferred profile. Maya watched Morrison, whose face had completely lost its initial arrogance. He wasn't just adjudicating a fraud case, he was witnessing live exposure of systematic discrimination that could trigger federal investigations and multi-million-dollar suits. Then Mrs. Kim stood in the gallery. "Your Honor, I request permission to speak as an unregistered witness." Morrison hesitated, clearly uncertain how to proceed in a case that had become something far larger than anticipated. "Professor Kim, this is highly unusual. 18 years ago, I taught Mandarin to a 15-year-old girl at a community center. She mastered in 8 months what university students require 3 years to learn. Today, that young woman is accused of fraud because people who never bothered assessing her actual talent decided her background makes her abilities impossible." The silence was absolute. Mrs. Kim continued, "If this court truly seeks justice, it must ask not whether Maya Carter falsified her qualifications, but why an entire industry conspired to invalidate talents that threatened their monopolies built on privilege, not competence." Morrison looked around. Cameras recording everything, journalists frantically documenting, faces in the gallery watching expectantly. He'd become the judge who would decide whether genuine talent mattered more than fabricated credentials. Under the weight of those expectant gazes, Morrison nervously adjusted his robe. What he didn't realize was that Maya had saved one final revelation that would transform this trial into a watershed moment for civil rights in professional industries. Morrison took a deep breath, realizing he'd completely lost control of his courtroom. The cameras captured every nuance of his discomfort, his prejudiced words already viral across social media. "Very well," he said tensely. "If you insist on this demonstration, proceed." Maya stood in the center of the room, her restraints finally removed. For a moment, she simply breathed, like an athlete preparing for the performance of a lifetime. "Your Honor, before I begin, I want to clarify something about the companies accusing me." James Park stood, activating his portable projector. The first image appeared, a text message thread between Tech Global executives. "This conversation was obtained legally," Maya announced. "Note the date, 3 weeks after I delivered my translation, which had already been approved by their Chinese business partners. Read what they discuss." Morrison adjusted his glasses, reading aloud reluctantly. "She delivered flawless work, but we can't establish precedent paying freelancers without degrees comparable to our staff translators. Find a technical excuse and terminate the contract." A shocked murmur rippled through the room. Stevens jumped up. "These messages could be fabricated." "Mr. Prosecutor," Maya smiled, "do you speak Mandarin? That's irrelevant." "It's not." Maya turned to Mrs. Kim. "Professor, would you read aloud the Chinese partner's evaluation of my translation?" Mrs. Kim stood, retrieved a document, and began reading in fluent Mandarin. Her voice resonated through the room with absolute academic authority. "Now I'll translate," Maya said calmly, and proceeded to render the Chinese into perfect English. "This is the most culturally nuanced and technically precise translation we've received in 7 years. The translator understands not only language, but the intentions and contexts behind communication. We enthusiastically recommend her services for all future projects." Morrison was visibly shaken. "How can we verify this translation's accuracy?" "Because," a new voice echoed from the doorway, "I wrote that evaluation personally." Everyone turned to see an elegant Chinese man entering. Dr. Liu Wei, Director of International Relations, Beijing Commerce Alliance. "I traveled from Beijing immediately upon hearing what's happening to Miss Carter." Dr. Liu approached the bench. "I've collaborated with Miss Carter on 4 projects. Her proficiency, not merely in Mandarin, but in specific regional dialects, business versus academic registers, and cultural context interpretation, is extraordinary. I've worked with Ivy League graduates who couldn't achieve what she accomplishes naturally. Stevens attempted one last desperate gambit. Even if the Mandarin translation was adequate, there remain problems with Arabic and Russian. Do you mean this problem? James activated an audio recording. The voice of World Aid CEO filled the room. Her translation was technically perfect, preserving the emotional authenticity of refugee testimonials. We hired a Harvard professor who diplomatically adapted the text, making it more formal. Result? The UN rejected it for sounding detached and bureaucratic rather than genuinely humanitarian. Morrison watched in horror as his courtroom became ground zero for exposing systematic discrimination, broadcast live to millions. But Maya wasn't finished. She had one more revelation that would change everything. Maya finally spoke, switching fluently between her 10 languages. She recited classical poetry in Arabic, discussed philosophical concepts in German, sang a traditional song in Portuguese, explained complex medical terminology in Russian, debated economic theory in Mandarin, each transition as natural as breathing. When she finished, the silence was profound. Even the journalists had stopped typing, simply witnessing something extraordinary. Dr. Liu broke the silence. In my 25 years evaluating linguistic competence internationally, I have never witnessed such natural and comprehensive mastery. This is what we call living languages. Not academic recitation, but genuine fluency. Morrison was visibly shaken. His phone buzzed incessantly, messages from judicial superiors, the ethics department, civil rights organizations, media outlets. Your Honor, Maya said softly, for 4 days I contemplated revenge against those who attempted destroying my reputation based purely on prejudice. But I realized something important. She paused, watching Morrison and Stevens squirm. The best revenge isn't inflicting the same damage they inflicted on me. The best revenge is exposing the truth so clearly, so irrefutably, that everyone sees exactly who they are and what they represent. At that moment, Morrison's clerk whispered urgently in his ear. His face lost all remaining color. "Miss Carter," he said in a broken voice, "all charges against you are hereby dismissed." He swallowed hard. This court offers a formal apology for inappropriate treatment and prejudicial statements. Stevens was frantically typing on his phone, probably attempting to salvage his career, but the public humiliation was only beginning. Dr. Chen stood. Your Honor, my client will be filing a federal civil rights lawsuit against all 4 companies for conspiracy to commit discrimination, defamation, and fraudulent accusations. We're also filing a formal complaint against this court for judicial bias. Morrison slumped in his chair, knowing his career was effectively over. But Maya had one final statement. Your Honor, I don't want revenge. I want change. I want every talented person from disadvantaged backgrounds to know that their abilities matter more than their credentials. I want every company that uses prejudice as business strategy to understand there are consequences. She turned to face the gallery, the cameras, the world watching. To everyone who's been told they're not good enough because of where they came from or what they look like, you are good enough. Your talent is real, and there are people who will fight for you. The courtroom erupted in applause, something that almost never happens in legal proceedings. But this wasn't just a legal victory. It was a moment of transformation. 6 months later, the ripple effects of Maya Carter's case would reshape professional translation services, corporate hiring practices, and judicial conduct nationwide. But that's a story of revolution. And it started with one woman refusing to accept that prejudice could define her truth.